This is a spoken summary of the second part of E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. Part 2 is titled The Curse of Adam. Where Part 1 traced political and religious traditions, Part 2 turns to the experience of labor itself, to the field laborer, the artisan, and the weaver, and to the changing nature of exploitation during the Industrial Revolution. Its central argument is that these years brought not simply new machines, but a transformation in the relations between men, felt by working people as a catastrophe, whatever the statistics of average wages may seem to say. Chapter 6. Exploitation. Thompson opens by challenging the idea that the working class was simply created by the steam engine and the cotton mill. Contemporaries certainly thought so. A magistrate spoke of a fresh race of beings, Robert Owen of a new character, and Engels called the factory hands the eldest children of the Industrial Revolution. Marx had put it epigrammatically, the hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist. But Thompson insists on a crucial qualification. For half a century after the breakthrough of the cotton mill around 1780, factory workers remained a minority. In the early 1830s, the cotton handloom weavers alone outnumbered all the men and women in the cotton, wool, and silk mills combined. The typical worker of 1830 was not a mill hand but an artisan, an outworker, or a laborer. The nucleus of the labor movement was made up of shoemakers, weavers, saddlers, printers, and building workers. He argues that three forces converged in these years: a population explosion, taking Great Britain from 10.5 million in 1801 to 18 million by 1841, the technology of the Industrial Revolution, and, decisively, the political counter-revolution of 1792 to 1832. The Napoleonic Wars, he reminds us, were also a war against Jacobinism. Aristocracy and manufacturers made common cause. The manufacturers won the repeal of the old paternalist legislation on apprenticeship and wage regulation, while the Combination Acts served both. Working people were forced into what Thompson calls political and social apartheid during the very wars they were required to fight. The heart of the chapter is a document, the address of a journeyman cotton spinner, from Manchester in 1818, the year Marx was born. It describes masters sprung from the cotton shop, without education, living in gorgeous palaces, petty monarchs, absolute and despotic, whose combination had been established at Stockport in 1802, and it describes children trained from 6 years old, working from 5 in the morning to 8 or 9 at night, fed on water gruel and oatcake. The spinner compares the English spinner-slave unfavorably with the Negro slave in the West Indies, who at least has a breeze of air to fan him. Thompson uses this to introduce the great standard of living controversy and offers his own resolution, a distinction between the standard of life, a matter of quantities, and the way of life, a matter of qualities. Over the years from 1790 to 1840, he concludes, there may have been a slight improvement in average material standards, and at the same time an intensification of exploitation, insecurity, and human misery, so that people experience this slight improvement as a catastrophe. And he states his master theme, the working class, made itself as much as it was made. Thompson sets his account against what he calls the anti-catastrophic orthodoxy. The classical view of the Industrial Revolution held by Marx, by Arnold Toynbee, by the Webbs, and by the Hammonds, had stressed the human suffering of the transition. A newer school, associated with Sir John Clapham, Dorothy George, and Professor Ashton, stressed growth rates, take-off, and improvement, and by the time of the Hayek Symposium of 1954, capitalism and the historians had turned the subject, in Thompson's view, into apologetics. He concedes that the Hammonds sometimes moralize their history, but defends their sense of the political context, and points out that even the optimists agree that real wages fell during the Napoleonic Wars. J. L. Hammond had written that the French Revolution divided the people of France less than the Industrial Revolution divided the people of England. Thompson insists, too, that the grievances of these years were often not simply matters of bread and butter, but of custom, justice, independence and security, and the survival of the family economy. And he measures the sheer growth of popular agitation, where in the 1790s Daniel Eaton had been jailed for publishing Paine. In the 1820s, Richard Carlile and his shopmen would serve, among them, over 200 years of imprisonment for the same cause. The scale of radical activity, he says, was reproduced tenfold after 1815. The contemporaries themselves reached for images of monstrous novelty. Peter Gaskell called the manufacturing population a Hercules in the cradle. Cook Taylor wrote of masses rising like the slow swell of an ocean. Thompson gathers the role of their agitations, the Luddite crisis of 1811 to 1813, the Pentrich Rising of 1817, Peterloo in 1819, and then trade unionism, Owenism, the 10 Hours Movement, the Revolutionary Crisis of 1831 and 1832, and Chartism, and insists that these were not a series of unconnected spasms, but the growth of a single class. He notes how contemporaries jumbled the skilled and the unskilled together as the lower orders, and how the Spinner's Address of 1818 had described the ruin of the little masters, who had once employed 20 or 30 hands, and whose wives earned 8, 10, or 12 shillings a week cleaning cotton, until a machine the workers called a devil reduced them to 4 or 5, while the steam engine demanded the capital to house 600 or 700 hands under one roof. The outstanding fact of the years from 1790 to 1830, Thompson maintains, is the formation of the working class, visible by 1832 in its trade unions, its friendly societies, its educational and religious movements, and its own periodicals. The standard of living controversy, Thompson stresses, cannot be settled by a single national average. Clapham had argued that after the price fall of 1820 and 1821, the purchasing power of wages was definitely greater than before the wars. J. L. Hammond replied that the national average concealed the fact that most of the laboring population lived in counties below it. Even the pessimist Hobsbawm and the optimist Ashton agree that real wages fell during the Napoleonic Wars. Thompson's own resolution rests on the distinction between the standard of life, which can be counted in loaves and boots and shillings, and the way of life, which cannot. A man might consume a few more ounces of sugar a year and yet have lost his common land, his leisure, his independence, and the security of his family economy. That, Thompson argues, is why working people, over these 50 years, could suffer a slight statistical improvement as a catastrophic experience, and it is why the plainest facts of the period are so fiercely contested. It is worth pausing on the spinner's comparison, which Thompson quotes with care, between the English factory child and the slave of the plantations. The Negro slave in the West Indies, the address ran, if he works under a scorching sun, has probably a little breeze of air sometimes to fan him. The English spinner slave has no enjoyment of the open atmosphere and breezes of heaven. The rhetorical force of the comparison, Thompson observes, lay in its literal seriousness for men who worked from 5 in the morning to 9 at night, in a heat and a dust that the freeborn Englishman had once thought fit only for the unfree. Chapter 7. The Field Laborers. The largest single group of workers was on the land, and Thompson argues that they experienced these years as a disaster obscured by statistics. He attacks the pursuit of what he calls the mythical average, the historian's habit of averaging unlike quantities, mixing the counties where enclosure fell heavily with those where it did not, and so diluting the loss until it seems not to amount to very much. One may not, he writes, take an average of unlike quantities. Enclosure is his central charge. When all the sophistications are allowed for, he writes, enclosure was a plain enough case of class robbery, played according to fair rules of property and law, laid down by a parliament of property owners and lawyers. The common right cottagers received no compensation, because in strict law they were not the owners of the rights they lost. The historian Chambers is quoted to the effect that enclosure tore down the thin and squalid curtain that had separated the growing army of laborers from utter proletarianization. But it was real. Thompson records resistance, such as the threatening letter to a Cheshunt landowner from those who signed themselves the Combined, warning that they would have his heart's blood. The counter-revolutionary drive to cheapen and discipline labor ran alongside. There wants a war to reduce wages, cried the northern gentry in the 1790s. Arthur Young feared the Commons bred a mischievous race as wild as the Finn. The Speenhamlin system of 1795, subsidizing wages from the rates, drove poor relief from under £2 million a year in the 1780s to over £6 million after 1812, and was later condemned as a bounty on indolence and vice. Laborers were auctioned, harnessed to carts, and, after the new Poor Law of 1834, advertised for migration to the northern mills like stock for sale. They joked bitterly that the farmers kept them like potatoes in a pit, and only took them out for use when they could no longer do without them. The chapter culminates in revolt, the East Anglian risings of 1816, and the last laborers, revolt of 1830, the swing movement, with its curiously indecisive and unbloodthirsty mobs, and its destruction of the threshing machines that were displacing already starving men. The Duke of Wellington organized magistrates on horseback with horsewhips and pistols. The Whig ministry sent special commissions, and in January 1831, death sentences and mass transportations were handed down across the southern counties. 3 years later, the Tolpuddle laborers of Dorset were transported for the crime of forming a trade union. Thompson closes on the enduring myth of lost land, the sense, carried into Chartism and Fergus O'Connor's land plan, that the people had been robbed of an ancient birthright in the soil. Thompson distinguishes 4 kinds of relationship between master and man on the land: the farm servant hired by the year and boarded in the house, a declining figure, the regular laborer on the large farm, the casual worker hired by the day or the piece, including women, children, and migratory Irish, and the skilled specialist who contracted for a particular job. He shows from a single Essex farmer's accounts how a laborer's nominal earnings concealed the sums he had to pay out to his own helpers. He weighs the pressure of Malthus, whose warnings against a bounty on population armed the reformers of the New Poor Law of 1834. And he lets Cobbett speak. When farmers became gentlemen, he wrote, their laborers became slaves. The revolt of 1830 he follows into the courtroom, where the special commissions handed down 23 death sentences at Buckingham, convicted 55 for machine breaking at Norwich, and left men for execution at Winchester and Salisbury. He gives the case of Joseph Carter of Sutton Scotney, made treasurer of the rising small funds, tempted to abscond with them but refusing, and transported to the Portsmouth hulks for 2 years, who told an interviewer that everybody was forced like to go, there was no denying. And he quotes the Norfolk laborers' letter to the gentlemen of their parish. We have counted up that we have gotten about 60 of us to one of you. Therefore, should you govern, so many to one. Behind it all lay the older tradition of Paine's agrarian justice and Spence's demand for the land, the conviction that the people had a right to the soil that had been taken from them. The war of attrition on poor relief between 1815 and 1834, he documents in grim particulars, the litigation over settlement that shuttled paupers from parish to parish, the stone breaking, the labor auctions at which a man's week was knocked down to the lowest bidder, the roundsmen driven from farm to farm, men harnessed like beasts to the parish cart. The historians Chambers and Mingay he cites for the judgment that the appropriation of the common waste tore down a thin and squalid curtain, but a real one, between the laborer and utter proletarianization. He recalls the East Anglian Rising of 1816, with its demand for a minimum wage of 2 shillings a day, and its destruction of the threshing machines, brutally repressed. And he returns, again and again, to the sense of a lost inheritance in the land, the feeling Cobbett gave voice to when he told the laborers that it was that accursed hill, Old Sarum, the rotten borough, that had robbed them. When at last, in 1834, 6 laborers of Tolpuddle in Dorset were transported for administering an unlawful oath in forming a union, the act seemed to gather up the whole history of rural defeat into a single exemplary punishment. Arthur Young's contempt for the independent poor Thompson quotes at length of the Lincolnshire fens. Young wrote that so wild a country nurses up a race of people as wild as the fen, and he feared that a laborer with a cow and a scrap of common would never submit to steady wage labor. The doctrine of the age held that there was a natural price of labor, set by the market, which must be allowed to oust the old notion of a just wage. Poor rates that had stood at under 2 millions a year in the 1780s passed 4 millions by 1803 and 6 millions after 1812, and the Poor Law Commissioners of 1834 denounced the whole Spiegelman system as a bounty on indolence and vice. Yet the hunger for land never died. It runs, Thompson shows, from the petitions of the 1830s and 40s down to Fergus O'Connor's Chartist land plan, and to the pamphlet of Old Robin, who told his fellows that Boney and the French had stolen all the land, an English grievance dressed in a foreign name. Cobbett gave the whole degradation its bitterest epigram. When farmers became gentlemen, he wrote, their laborers became slaves. And traveling the southern counties, he would point again and again to the contrast between the swelling rent rolls of the great and the sinking condition of the men who worked their fields. The laborers themselves understood the arithmetic of their situation, and put it, in the Norfolk letter Thompson quotes, with a dreadful plainness, "We have counted up that we have gotten about 60 of us to one of you." Chapter 8. Artisans and Others. Here Thompson insists again that the characteristic worker of 1830 was the artisan or mechanic in a small workshop, or the casual laborer, not the factory operative. After agricultural laborers and domestic servants, of whom there were some 670,000 women alone, the building trades were the largest group. Shoemaking was the largest single artisan trade, followed by tailoring. In London there were perhaps 100,000 journeymen. Custom, not supply and demand, was supposed to govern the artisan's wage. There was a notion of a fair price and a just wage, and an elaborate hierarchy within each trade, from the coach bodymaker who earned £2 or £3 a week, down to the smith. Thompson describes a labor aristocracy that was not, as is sometimes thought, a creation of the 1850s, but already old, the master artisan as good as a master, and a newer elite of iron, engineering, and machine-making skills. Even within cotton, the census of 1841 enumerated over 1,200 subdivisions of employment. We are not, as one worker put it, cotton spinners all. The chapter's central argument concerns underemployment. A textbook might claim that between 1790 and 1831, urban wages rose far faster than the cost of living. But such figures rest on skilled men in full work, and the first half of the century was in fact a period of chronic underemployment. Mayhew's later guess was that of the working class, only a third were fully employed, a third partially, and a third wholly unemployed, and that the society men, the union men, of any trade were only about a tenth of the whole. Thompson traces the splitting of trade after trade into an honorable and a dishonorable section, the second sweated and unorganized. He gives case histories: the engineering trade transformed by Maudslay's slide rest, and an influx of unapprenticed youths after the repeal of the apprenticeship clauses of the Statute of Artificers in 1814. The London tailors, divided into flints and dungs and drilled by an almost military system of houses of call; the shoemakers, whose rash second strike let the masters organize and defeat them. The rewards of the march of progress, Thompson writes, always seem to be gathered by someone else. He corrects a common assumption about outwork. It was not a picturesque survival from before the machine. On the contrary, steam and the factory were its multipliers, for the mills spun the yarn, and the foundries made the nail rod on which the outworkers depended. Large-scale sweated outwork, he insists, was as intrinsic to the Industrial Revolution as the factory and the steam engine. Below the artisan lay the lower depths, the casual laborers, the street sellers, the beggars, and the workhouse, which the reformers of 1834 intended, in their own words, to make as like prisons as possible. It is a prison, Crabbe had written, with a milder name. Thompson fills the chapter with the voices of the trades. He gives the story of Thomas Large, a Leicester stocking weaver who came to London in 1812 and was astonished to find the Carpenters' Society sitting on a permanent fund of £20,000, and who listed the well-combined London trades, the tailors, shoemakers, bookbinders, gold beaters, printers, bricklayers, and hatters, earning no less than 30 shillings and up to 5 guineas a week, while his own framework knitters lived in a miserable condition. He evokes Birmingham as the metropolis of the small master, where, Southey complained, every man he met stank of train oil and emery, turning out buckles and buttons and guns and snuff-boxes. He quotes Mayhew's shock at passing from the skilled artisan of the West End to the unskilled laborer of the East, as if into a new land and among another race, the artisans almost to a man red-hot politicians, the laborers as unpolitical as footmen. He describes the miners as an hereditary caste, and Cobbett's envy of the Durham pitmen with their 24 shillings a week and their free coal, and he analyzes the insecurity of skills through the engineering trade, transformed after the repeal of the apprenticeship laws in 1814 by Maudslay's slide rest, nicknamed the go-cart, and by an influx of unapprenticed youths. One great London employer, Galloway, an old member of the Corresponding Society, passed 1,000 to 1,500 men through his works in a dozen years. The two critical periods, Thompson concludes, were 1812 to 1814, when the apprenticeship regulations were repealed against a petition bearing 60,000 names, and 1833 to 1835, the years of the great trade union wave, its defeat, and the transportation of the toll-puddle men. The elaborate hierarchies of custom Thompson illustrates from the coach-building trade, where the bodymaker formed an aristocracy, earning 2 or 3 pounds a week, while the herald painter might earn 3 or 4, all sustained by a benevolent society, whose officers were nonetheless prosecuted under the Combination Acts. He records the wage series Francis Place compiled for the London tailors, rising from 25 shillings in 1795 to 36 by 1813, and notes Place's insistence that not a single shilling was ever obtained but by compulsion. The trade was drilled through its houses of call in an almost military system and split between the honorable Flints and the dishonorable Dungs, until by Mayhew's day, only some 3,000 of more than 23,000 London tailors remained society men. He describes William Lovett, later a leader of the cabinet makers and of the Chartists, living in his first London poverty on a penny loaf a day and a drink from the most convenient pump. And he ends among the workhouses of the New Poor Law, which its own commissioners intended to make as like prisons as possible, and whose inmates numbered over 78,000 in 3 months of 1838, and nearly 200,000 by 1843. Thompson enriches the picture with the smaller trades and their humiliations. At Wolverhampton, a garret master might sell his very bed to buy an anvil, and earn 7 shillings as his own master, where he had earned 10 as another servant. In the card-setting shops, children set 1,500 or 1,600 wire teeth for a halfpenny. In Sheffield, the cutlers enforced their customs by rattening, the quiet removal of a workman's tools. And behind the honorable trades pressed always the reserve of cheap, unapprenticed, and juvenile labor that could break a strike and drag a craft down into the dishonorable, sweated section. Mayhew's estimate, that of the whole working class only a third were in full work, a third in partial work, and a third wholly unemployed, and that the society men were but 1/10 of any trade, gives the measure of the insecurity that no wage table can show. The march of progress, Thompson repeats, brought new skills and new rewards, but they were almost always the perquisite of different people. Thompson is careful, too, about the meaning of outwork, which the textbooks had treated as a quaint survival from before the age of the machine. On the contrary, he argues, it was the machine's own creation, multiplied by it. The mills that spun the yarn and the foundries that drew the nail rod threw out ever more work to be finished in the garret and the cottage, so that the sweated outworker and the factory operative were not relics of 2 different ages, but twin products of the same revolution. Large-scale outwork, he insists, was as intrinsic to the Industrial Revolution as the factory and the steam engine themselves. Chapter 9. The Weavers. The history of the weavers in the 19th century, Thompson writes, is haunted by the legend of better days. He defends the reality behind that legend against historians who dismiss the Golden Age as a myth, and argues that the weavers suffered a genuine and catastrophic decline in status and living standards between roughly 1780 and 1840, driven not chiefly by the power loom, but by the breakdown of custom and trade union protection, by total exposure to wage cutting, and by the overstocking of the trade. He distinguishes several kinds of weaver, from the self-employed superior artisan who chose his masters to the journeyman and the farmer weaver, all of them merging over these decades into the debased proletarian outworker. William Radcliffe recalled the years from 1788 to 1803 as the golden age of the cotton trade, when weaving families had watches, clocks in mahogany cases, and handsome tea services, some even keeping a cow. But wage cutting was pursued as a positive good. Poverty was held to be a spur to industry, and it was seriously argued that a reduction of wages in the woolen manufacture would be a national blessing. Wages were driven down to 9 shillings, 6 shillings, 4 and 6 pence a week, and less. Thompson is emphatic that the power loom was not the primary cause. The weavers' status was already shattered by 1813, when there were only some 2,400 power looms in the whole kingdom. The real engine of ruin was surplus labor, 100,000 weavers, he says, doing the work of 150,000, undercutting one another. He records the great confrontations, the strike and demonstration of 1808 in St. George's Fields, Manchester, dispersed with bloodshed, after which the weavers gave a silver cup to Colonel Hanson, to which nearly 40,000 people contributed, and the general strike of 1818. He describes the wool combers, the elite of the worsted trade, with their festival of Bishop Blaise, and their bitter 23-week strike at Bradford in 1825, which ended in total defeat. The depths were terrible. Cobbett in 1832 saw men who had once earned 20 or 30 shillings now on 5 or 4 or less. A Huddersfield committee found thousands subsisting on 2d. a day per head, and a diet of oatcake, potatoes, and blue milk gave way, in the worst years, to typhus and to burial clubs for children. Yet Thompson also records the extraordinary weaver culture, the weaver poets and botanists and self-taught mathematicians who chalked their geometry on the flagstones, and the many Chartist leaders drawn from among the outworkers. The weavers fought for a legal minimum wage through trade boards, but the bill was rejected by the Commons. Political economy told them instead to flee from the trade. The weavers were the largest single group of industrial workers in England, and, Thompson writes, we have looked at the people who were multiplied. Thompson conducts the argument against Dorothy George, who had called the weavers' golden age a myth, and against the optimists who muddle over the change from artisan to depressed outworker with comforting phrases. He recalls the Yorkshire domestic system of the little master clothier, whom he calls the peasant or small kulak of the Industrial Revolution, and the Oldham check weavers, case of 1759, in which the assize judge rejected apprenticeship and anticipated Adam Smith and the repeal of the Statute of Artificers by more than half a century, asking, if the foot aspire to be the head, to what end are laws enacted? He records the woolcombers, organized since the 1740s, with their triennial festival of Bishop Blaise at Bradford, and their disastrous strike of 1825, and the weaver culture of self-taught poets, botanists, and mathematicians, from which so many Chartist leaders would come, men such as Benjamin Rushton of Halifax and Richard Pilling, the father of the Plug riots. He follows the long fight for a legal minimum wage. Fielden's bill was rejected by the Commons by 41 votes to 129, and Nassau Senior's Royal Commission preached only laissez-faire, telling the weaver to flee from the trade, with the result that there were 100,000 fewer cotton weavers in 1840 than in 1830. The Select Committee estimated that between 800,000 and 840,000 people were wholly dependent on the loom. Marx himself is cited on the shamelessness of the exploitation of outwork. Thompson lets Radcliffe's memory of the Golden Age stand in detail, the loom shops multiplying, the families with a watch in every cottage, and a clock in a mahogany case, before he traces the fall. He describes the general strike of 1818, the philanthropic Hercules, when the weavers locked their shuttles in the chapels, and its collapse in the imprisonment of the leaders, the last effective general strike of the Lancashire weavers. He records the diet of the worst years, the oatcake and onion porridge and blue milk, the typhus that swept the hillside hamlets, the childbirth without a change of bedding, and the burial clubs into which a penny a week was paid against the death of a child. And he sets out the remedies the weavers themselves proposed: a tax on the power loom, the restriction of factory hours, and the employment of adult men at the power loom, remedies all refused. He points to the arithmetic of a state that taxed bread and malt and soap, but left the power loom untaxed, and that spent, of some 50 millions of revenue, 28 millions on the interest of the national debt. 100,000 weavers, he repeats, were doing the work of 150,000, and the poor law of 1834, with its Bastilles, struck at them directly. The depths of the weavers, declined Thompson documents town by town. At Bradford, the woolcombers, unions still counted 7,000 or 8,000 men. A Huddersfield Masters Committee found more than 13,000 of the town's people subsisting on 2d. a day. At Saddleworth, thousands of families were paupers in what he calls an industrial Speenhamland, and a Select Committee heard of a family at West Houghton found starving, with half the inhabitants of the place totally destitute of bedding. Cobbett, traveling in 1832, saw men who had once earned 20 or 30 shillings now trying to live on 5 or 4 or less. Yet the same communities produced the weaver poets and the singers of Joan O., Grenfilt, and self-taught scholars such as Samuel Law of Todmorden, who knew his Virgil and his Homer. It was from these outworking villages, and not from the factories, that so much of the leadership of Chartism would come, which is why Thompson insists that we must not mistake the handloom weaver for a mere relic. He was, for a time, among the most characteristic workers of the age. The scale of the tragedy, Thompson insists, must be held steadily in view. The weavers were the largest single group of industrial workers in the country, ranking in the occupational tables behind only the agricultural laborers and the domestic servants. The Select Committee of 1834 and 1835 reckoned that between 800,000 and 840,000 persons were wholly dependent on the loom. This was no marginal craft dying quietly in a corner, but a great population, multiplied by the very growth of the mills that spun their yarn, and then abandoned to the free play of a market that told them only to flee from the trade. Chapter 10. Standards and Experiences. This chapter takes the standard of living controversy off the ground of hypothetical wage rates and onto the ground of actual experience, under 4 headings: goods, homes, life, and childhood. Thompson concedes that national product grew faster than population between 1790 and 1840, but argues that the working class share of that product had almost certainly fallen, and that the gross returns are deceptive because they include an expanding middle class. On goods, he examines diet: bread, meat, beer, tea, sugar, and the potato. Per capita consumption of wheat and of meat probably fell. The historian of the potato, Solomon, identified 1795 as the critical year in the Battle of the Loaf, when landowners and parsons pushed the laborer from wheat to the potato, a substitution felt as a degradation. Bread price, Thompson repeats, was the first index of the poor man's condition. The banner at Peterloo would read, "No corn laws." His verdict on goods is an unremarkable record, in which the average working man remained very close to subsistence. On homes, he notes that the individual house might be better than the rural hovel the immigrant had left, but that as towns aged, water supply, sanitation, and overcrowding decayed into the appalling conditions exposed by the sanitary inquiries of the 1840s and the cholera epidemics of 1831 and 1848. He refuses to let the diffusion of blame among small speculators mitigate the conditions themselves. Ardwick, he quotes, knows less about Ancoats than it does about China. The Coke towns were the first great towns dedicated single-mindedly to work and to fact. On life, he turns to mortality. Infant mortality in the new industrial towns ran at up to twice the rural rate. Dr. Holland's Sheffield figures showed more than 6,000 of nearly 12,000 deaths over 5 years were of children under 5, and under 5 mortality of around 500 in every 1,000. A survey of Manchester spinners found that of their children, nearly 40 in every 100 had died. The tables of average age at death by class are stark. In Manchester, 38 for the gentry, 20 for tradesmen, 17 for laborers. The middle-class gains, Holland warned, mask the worsening position of the most numerous class, deceiving us into the belief that society is gradually improving. On childhood, Thompson makes his gravest charge: a drastic increase in the intensity of the exploitation of children between 1780 and 1840. Child labor was not new, but the factory system systematized it and dictated its environment, its discipline, and its speed, while the counter-revolutionary climate of the wars dissolved the old humanitarian conscience. He cites the 8-year-old trapper alone in the dark of the mine, and Patience Kershaw, 17, with the bald place on her head worn by pushing the coal corves, who said she would rather work in the mill than in the coal pit. Against those who speak of an awakening of social conscience, Thompson holds to the traditional view that the exploitation of little children, on this scale and with this intensity, was one of the most shameful events in our history. On goods, Thompson adds the record of drink. Beer consumption fell in the early decades, while tea, sugar, and cheap spirits rose, and the Beer Act of 1830 opened some 35,000 beer shops within 5 years. The poorest, he notes, would beg used tea leaves or pour water over a burnt crust. On homes, he cites Southwood Smith's report that nothing had been done for the districts of the London poor and the cholera epidemics that at last forced attention. On life, he draws on Krauss to argue that the population explosion owed more to a rising birth rate than to any fall in the death rate, so that a rising birth rate is no evidence of rising living standards. And he quotes Thackeray of Leeds, that not 10% of the inhabitants of large towns enjoy full health. He details the mechanisms of infant death: mothers back at the mill 3 weeks after childbirth, babies quieted with laudanum and with rag dummies of bread soaked in milk. On childhood, he shows how the older labor within the family economy, in which even Crompton's sons had trodden cotton in a tub, was transformed by specialization and by the collapse of humanitarianism. He weighs the partisan Sadler Committee of 1832 against the Factory Commission of 1833, whose mills were whitewashed and whose underage children were hidden before the inspectors came, and finds the workers, evidence compelling nonetheless. He enlists the disappointed romantics, Wordsworth's excursion lamenting that the birthright is now lost, and Southey's judgment that the manufacturing system was a fungus excrescence from the body politic. And he records the appalling declension in the social conscience of Dissent, the mill owner who worked children to near midnight on Saturday and then enforced the Sunday school, and the boy on the Cragdale tour who worked 17 hours was carried home, asked whether he could see the mill lights, and died. Childhood and poverty, in Tawney's phrase, are the touchstones by which this age must be judged. Thompson lays out the tables of average age at death by social class, town by town, and lets them speak. In Liverpool, 35 years for the gentry, 22 for tradesmen, 15 for laborers. In Bethnal Green, 45, 26 and 16. In rural Rutland, 52, 41 and 38. Dr. Holland's Sheffield register named consumption, convulsions, and inflammation of the lungs as the great killers, and recorded, over 5 years, only a single death attributed to want of food, a figure he thought a gross undercount. On childhood, Thompson multiplies the evidence, the boards of guardians apprenticing pauper boys of 6 and 7 and 8 to the colliers, wholly in the power of the buddies, the billy roller with which the overseer struck the children, Fielding's book, The Curse of the Factory System, written by a mill owner turned reformer, Osler's cry that he would put an end to the freedom of murder and to the freedom of working children beyond their strength, and Lord Shaftesbury's despair that the Anglican clergy, as a body, would do nothing. The chapter is, Thompson later admitted, an ungenerous one, written as a polemic against an economic history that had become, in his phrase, a commitment to the ideology of economic growth. The substitution of the potato for wheaten bread Thompson treats as a symbol of the whole dissent, quoting Ebenezer Elliott's scorn for Aaron's root-fed hordes, and he recalls that when the Corn Laws were passed in 1815, Parliament had to be defended by troops, and that a banner at Peterloo would demand no Corn Laws. The survey of Manchester spinners in 1833 found that of more than 3,000 children born to them, nearly 40 in every 100 were already dead. Thackeray, walking the Leeds streets, thought he saw a degenerate race. And the complicity of respectable Dissent Thompson drives home through Francis Trollope's novel Michael Armstrong, and through the mill owner who worked his children until near midnight on the Saturday and then marched them to the Sunday school. Against the comfortable thesis of an awakening of social conscience, he sets the plain fact that 8 parliamentary inquiries in 10 years preceded the smallest reform, and holds instead to the older judgment that the exploitation of little children, on this scale and with this intensity, was one of the most shameful events in our history. The plainest measure of the age, Thompson suggests, is the difference in the average age at death between the classes in a single town, a difference that the gross national figures entirely conceal. It was Dr. Holland of Sheffield who drew the moral. The gross returns, he warned, deceive us into the belief that society is gradually improving in its physical and social condition, when in fact the most numerous class may be stationary, or in the process of deterioration. To count the whole and miss the parts, Thompson agrees, is to lose precisely the human truth that the historian is bound to recover. Chapter 11. The Transforming Power of the Cross. This chapter asks how Methodism could function during the Industrial Revolution as what Thompson calls the moral machinery that recast the character of the worker into the disciplined, submissive psyche demanded by factory capitalism, while serving at once as the religion of the exploiters and of the exploited. He explains this double role through 3 forces: direct indoctrination, the sense of community, and, above all, what he names the chiliasm of despair. The first section, Moral Machinery, traces the decline from Puritanism through dissent into nonconformity, and rests on the work discipline argument of Weber and Tawney. The manufacturer Robert Peel testified that he left his works under the management of Methodists, who served him excellently well. The central figure is Jabez Bunting, the dominant Orthodox Wesleyan from the years of Ludism to those of Chartism, who disowned the Methodist Luddites, cultivated the Tory magistrates, and declared that Methodism hates democracy as much as it hates sin. In Sheffield, he attacked the teaching of writing in the Sunday schools as an abuse of the Sabbath. Dr. Andrew Ure, whom Thompson calls the Richard Baxter of the cotton mills, supplied the doctrine directly. It is, Ure wrote, excessively the interest of every mill owner to organize his moral machinery on equally sound principles with his mechanical. The theology of universal grace offered a spiritual egalitarianism, but a provisional one, shadowed always by the threat of backsliding in hell. And Thompson does not spare its psychology, its morbid preoccupation with sin, and its sublimated, masochistic imagery of the blood of the Lamb. Leakey's judgment is quoted: "A more appalling system of religious terrorism has seldom existed." The second section, The Chiliasm of Despair, is the chapter's boldest argument. Why did working people submit? Thompson answers with indoctrination, with community, and with the psychic consequences of political defeat. Wesley had taught that a child's will must be broken. "Break their wills betimes," he wrote. "Break the will if you would not damn the child." Yet the same church offered the uprooted migrant a community and a ticket of membership that served as a passport between towns. And revivalism, Thompson argues, following Karl Mannheim on the ebbing of chiliastic hope into a naked mass frenzy, tended to take over just at the point where political or temporal aspirations met with defeat. He charts the membership figures rising from some 60,000 at the eve of the French Revolution to nearly 250,000 by 1830, and notes how the Great Revival years followed years of political disappointment. This is his counter-thesis to Halevi and to Hobsbawm, not that Methodism advanced when radicalism advanced, but that it surged as a despairing recoil when radicalism was crushed. The prophets of the age, Richard Brothers and Joanna Southcott, who sold seals to as many as 100,000 of the sealed people, belong to this same oscillation. Yet the authoritarian doctrine bred its own libertarian antithesis. Methodist radicals, such as the Halifax Weaver preacher Ben Rushton and the Tolpuddle martyr George Lovelace, turned the Old Testament into an allegory of oppression. Who was Rushton, Thompson asks at the close, but the Adam whom Bunting's God had cursed? Thompson develops the argument through a gallery of figures and documents. He quotes Mark Rutherford on the Hollow, Formal Services of Decayed Nonconformity, and the Minute Book of the Halifax local preachers, one of whom was charged with attending a political meeting when he should have been at his class. He shows the Committee of Privileges circulating its condemnation of tumultuous assemblies after Peterloo, and Bunting extirpating the teaching of writing from the Sunday schools. He reads the conversion narrative of the sailor Joshua Marsden as a case study in the recasting of the personality, and dwells unsparingly on the sexual imagery of the hymns, the wounds, and the blood of the Lamb, and on the model of Bunting in the Reverend Jabez Branderham of Wuthering Heights, with his sermon of 490 parts. On indoctrination, he cites Isaac Watts's Divine Songs, Hannah More's insistence that children have a corrupt nature, and the girl who told a mines commissioner that if she died a good girl, she should go to heaven. He lists the Great Revival years, and sets them beside the years of political defeat. The Pentridge Rising of 1817 was followed by the sweeping primitive Methodist revival, the Ranters, who had gathered by the thousand at the Mo-Cop camp meetings. And he ends on the reactive dialectic by which an authoritarian faith bred its own rebels, on the Weaver preacher Ben Rushton, whose Chartist funeral in 1853 drew an oration from Ernest Jones. Thompson roots the argument in the testimony of the manufacturers themselves. Robert Peel the elder said that he had left most of his works under the management of Methodists, and they served him excellently well. Dr. Andrew Ure, in his Philosophy of Manufactures, praised the factory as a vast automaton, and Arkwright, for his Napoleonic nerve, held that godliness is great gain, and asked where mankind should find the power to transform the untamed worker, answering, in the cross of Christ, the phrase from which the chapter takes its title. Wesley's own school at Kingswood had allowed the children only workful recreations. Thompson charts the membership climbing decade by decade, from some 90,000 in 1800 to 138,000 in 1810, 191,000 in 1820, and nearly 249,000 in 1830, and matches the surges of revival to the troughs of political hope. He weighs the awkward cases honestly: the Cornish tenors, whose revival of 1814 owed nothing to politics; the Shropshire colliers, whose revival after the Cinderhill riots fits the thesis exactly, and concludes that both the whole population and a floating section of it oscillated between the chapel and the platform. Cobbett raged against the preachers, canting gibberish, and out of the same Methodist ground came the Ranters and the Primitive Methodists, preached, as one said, by the poor. The psychology of the revival Thompson probes without mercy, describing the Sabbath as a release of feeling that made the weekday's labor endurable, and the whole apparatus of hellfire as a system of religious terrorism, in Leakey's phrase, such as had seldom existed. Hazlitt had called the Methodists a collection of religious invalids, Against all this, Thompson sets Blake's everlasting gospel as the authentic countervoice. But he is equally concerned with what Methodism gave. To the uprooted migrant a community, and a ticket of membership that served as a passport from town to town, a training in committee and class and collection that could, in other hands, build a trade union or a Hampton Club. Following Mannheim, he argues that when the chiliastic hope of a transformed world is defeated in the political arena, it does not simply vanish but returns as a naked mass frenzy in the chapel. That is the chiliasm of despair, and it is why, in Thompson's reading, the map of revival and the map of political defeat so often lie one upon the other. Thompson gives the source of his chapter's title its full weight. Ewer had asked where mankind should find the transforming power that would reconcile the worker to the discipline of the mill, and had answered that it lay in the cross of Christ. The moral machinery on this view was to be organized on principles as sound as the mechanical. It is against this frank identification of religion with labor discipline that Thompson sets the whole double character of Methodism, a faith that could break a child's will and reconcile a man to the factory bell, and yet, in the mouths of its own rebel preachers, could turn the book of Exodus into a charter of deliverance. Chapter 12. Community. The final chapter of Part 2 argues that the working-class community of the early 19th century was chiefly the product of conscious working-class endeavor, and not the gift of paternalism or of Methodism. As industrial discipline eroded the old leisure, custom and family economy, working people built countervailing institutions of their own, and in doing so generated a new class consciousness. The first section examines the assault on popular leisure and personal relations by the combined forces of Methodism and utilitarianism, which Thompson calls together the dominant ideology of the Industrial Revolution. Wilberforce served as Pitt's moral lieutenant, invoking the grand law of subordination. The Society for the Suppression of Vice prosecuted Sabbath breakers by the 100 and persecuted fairs, dances, and two-penny hops. Cobbett protested that it is a great error to suppose that people are rendered stupid by remaining always in the same place. Bamford and the Pudsey chronicler Joseph Lawson recorded the older customs of witches and boggarts, rush-bearing and Morris dancing before they were driven out. Thompson also weighs the ambiguous effect of these years on women, noting the female reform societies founded in 1818 and 1819, and Cobbett's defense of them, though Cobbett himself did not support the suffrage for women. The second section, The Rituals of Mutuality, is the positive core of the chapter. Thompson traces the friendly societies and box clubs, whose membership rose from some 640,000 in 1793 to over 900,000 by 1815, with their elaborate rules and fines, their secrecy, and their ethos of collective self-respect. This collectivist value system, with its sanctions against the blackleg, is, he argues, what most sharply distinguishes the 19th century working class from the 18th century mob. He borrows Raymond Williams's phrase, the basic collective idea, and marvels, with the observer Cook Taylor, at working people who bore the extreme of wretchedness with a high tone of moral dignity. By 1830, he notes, the churches were losing the poor, and free thought and Owenism were spreading, in one phrase, like winds on the common. Engels found that the workers are not religious. The third section is on the Irish. By 1841, over 400,000 inhabitants of Great Britain had been born in Ireland, driven by the repression that followed the rebellion of 1798 and the Union of 1800 as much as by the potato. Thompson describes their value to employers, precisely because they had escaped the imprint of Baxter and Wesley and would spend themselves in heavy manual labor, and the role of the poorest priesthood in Europe. But he stresses the political confluence, the alliance of Irish nationalism and English radicalism, from the United Irishmen who helped defend Hardy's house to the great Chartist Feargus O'Connor, and the way the passionate Irish temperament, in Engels's words, softened the cold, rational English character. The final section, Myriads of Eternity, returns to the standard of living debate to insist that beneath the word standard, we must always find judgments of value as well as questions of fact. Thompson defends the cataclysmic view. During the years between 1780 and 1840, he writes, the people of Britain suffered an experience of immiseration, even if it is possible to show a small statistical improvement in material conditions. People were moved less by their own will than at the dictate of external compulsions, of enclosure, war, and the poor laws. And he offers the sentence that gathers the whole of Part 2. It is neither poverty nor disease, but work itself, which cast the blackest shadow over the years of the Industrial Revolution. Borrowing his title from Blake, he pictures men and women sealed in their work as in a tomb. The one enduring thing they built was the cohesion which the working people, in antagonism to their labor and to their masters, made for themselves. Thompson traces the assault on the old calendar of leisure, on St. Monday, the wakes and the fairs, and on Bartholomew Fair itself, which the authorities feared as a rendezvous for sedition. He records the founding of the female reform societies at Blackburn, Bolton, and Manchester in 1818 and 1819, women voting by show of hands at the great meetings, and Cobbett's retort to those who mocked them, just as if women were made for nothing but to cook oatmeal and to sweep a room. He details the friendly societies, rules, the fines for drunkenness and cursing and for calling one another by nicknames, the clauses excluding illness got by disorderly living, and the bans on political and religious dispute, and the Masonic secrecy of the woolcombers, which he takes as authentic evidence of the growth of an independent working-class culture. He describes the ceremonial pride of the trades, the Preston guilds, the woolcombers and their wool wigs, and the Union banners unfurled after the repeal of the Combination Acts, the shipwrights under John Gast, the shoemakers under King Crispin. On the Irish, he adds the figure of John Doherty, who came from an Irish cotton mill to become the greatest of Lancashire's labor leaders, and the agrarian secret societies, the threshers and the ribbon men, whose methods were carried into English struggles. And in the closing section, he gathers his witnesses to immiseration. R. M. Martin's testimony that the people had become a sordid, discontented, miserable, anxious, struggling people, and D. H. Lawrence's later verdict on the ugliness that had betrayed the spirit of man in the 19th century, the workers unable even to secure a decent funeral. Thompson measures the reforming assault in numbers. The Society for the Suppression of Vice brought over 600 prosecutions for Sabbath breaking in a single year, while the War Minister Wyndham defended the people's bull-baiting under the slogan, Wyndham and Liberty. Against this, he sets the Friendly Societies, whose membership climbed from some 648,000 in 1793 to over 900,000 by 1815, and the Guild Pride of the Trades, the Bradford Woolcombers, processing in their wool wigs on the feast of Bishop Blaise. On the Irish, he adds, the poorest priesthood in Europe, living on some £65 a year off their flock, Daniel O'Connell and the Catholic Association, and the winning of Catholic emancipation in 1829. In the closing section, he confronts the deniers of immiseration directly, rebuking C.P. Snow's easy claim that the poor simply walked off the land into the factories, and returning Ure's boast that the manufacturer was the great minister of civilization to the light of the mortality tables. Beneath the word standard, he insists, we must always find judgments of value as well as questions of fact, and his own judgment is that between 1780 and 1840, the people of Britain suffered an experience of immiseration, whatever the small statistical improvement in their material conditions. The positive achievement of the working-class community Thompson locates in what Raymond Williams called the basic collective idea, the discovery that the individual could only defend himself by combining with his neighbors. The rules of the small ware weavers of Manchester, drawn up in the 1750s, had already condemned intemperance, animosity, and profaneness as the pest and vermin of society. The box clubs fined the member who disclosed their secrets or who fell ill through disorderly living. This collective self-respect, with its stern sanctions against the blackleg, is what most sharply divides the 19th century working class from the 18th century mob. By 1830, the churches were losing their hold on the poor, and Engels could report that the workers are not religious, save the Irish and the half-bourgeois. The one thing that endured, Thompson concludes, was not what was done to working people, but what they made for themselves. Their unions, their clubs, their chapels of their own choosing, and the conviction, against their labor and against their masters, that they were a class with interests of its own. The friendly societies and trade clubs, Thompson argues, were schools of a new morality as much as instruments of relief, and their very secrecy, so alarming to magistrates, was the authentic sign of an independent culture taking shape below the level of the respectable and the recorded. When he turns at the last to the balance sheet of the Industrial Revolution, he refuses to reckon it in wages alone. It is neither poverty nor disease, he writes, but work itself which cast the blackest shadow over these years, and the one lasting gain was the solidarity that working people, in their antagonism to that work and to their masters, had built for themselves and would carry forward into the Chartist years. This concludes Part 2, The Curse of Adam. Across these 7 chapters, Thompson has followed the experience of exploitation through the field laborer, the artisan, and the weaver, measured the true cost of the Industrial Revolution in diet, housing, mortality, and the labor of children, and shown how Methodism disciplined the poor even as their own institutions of mutuality gave them a new collective identity. Part 3 will follow the emergence of that identity into open political life, from the radicalism of Westminster through the underground of Ludism and the martyrdoms of Pentridge and Peterloo to the achievement of a mature working-class consciousness.